Why are these companies so resistant to there being maybe it's just even outwardly, like discernible consequences,
Yeah,
I think it was like a New York Times thing about Amazon a year or two ago.
yeah,
I'm sure you remember that, right?
all right,
Like,
yeah,
I'm sure something happened because of that. It doesn't seem to happen in games, or if it does, it's just sort of they lock down more tightly. I mean, that's something I'm perennially interested in, and of course, as I'm sure you'll imagine, it's difficult to get people to go on the record about. I have gotten people to go on the record about it. I don't know. I mean, it just doesn't seem to
yeah,
change much. And so
yeah.
maybe my going into it thinking, I don't even think it's necessarily about the fans having more compassion. I think it's just like, as a species, we should just not do that to each other. I don't know that it's necessarily worth it. I mean, is mankind
Right.
better because we now have the HD version of, you know what I mean?
Dark Souls.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
No, I mean, I think it's worse. I think that's a horrible game.
yeah.
And
I
it's,
think, yeah. I think we
but
tend to be in the minority on these types of opinions, but yeah.
yeah. But yeah, I mean, those are the kinds of questions that you want to see like wrestled with in public. I think as a reader, like I'm a reader of game sites, and like
Yeah.
it's it's always frustrating to see like the questions that are sidestepped or
Yeah.
treated as just matters of disagreement, or it's like, well, like no shit, it's a matter of like personal opinion, so like lay your opinions out and like you know put them into a dialectic. Let's hear it, like let's have
Yeah.
them sort of play out against each other. It's not just sort of like, well, here's what I think and here's what I think, and then like we move on.
I mean,
It's like,
this type of thought is just sort of in a no man's land of, I don't know where it's supposed to land. Like, because I've sort of fallen down on it's too much about games for more mainstream focused publications, and it's too much about people for
yeah.
game focused publications. So there either has to be somewhere else to go, or it's just not going to happen in our lifetime. You know what I mean?
Well, yeah, I think it is happening. I think
Well, maybe it's
what
just too slow, or it's not as fast as you'd like. If you feel like you've already been seeing it for a while, that's fair.
it's just not going to come from the games press. If if there's
Yeah.
anything I've sort of like gleaned from my time working inside the games press and then sort of like
Yeah.
adjacent to it, and still feeling like very much connected to it, even though I'm not necessarily like active as much anymore. Um, like like I feel like as an industry, like the games press has missed the story in front of their noses, and it's being picked up by other people, and like it's just there's been sort of like by design like very little of value created in the games press. you know like
Yeah.
I would include my own writing in that. I look back at a lot of the stuff I've written, and it's like there's a huge gap between what I wanted it to do and what it wound up being. And
Mm-hmm.
there's a lot of reasons for that. I think one's like my own inexperience, and it's sort of like you go into the games press, you have to learn in public. Like it's
Right.
like going to college with a live stream on your thought process for like through all the awkward, embarrassing things that you just sort of like go through, and like without a stronger sense of mentorship and
Yeah.
like the level of writing and the level of argument and the level of research, it just it remains just kind of stuck in this gossip level kind of mode of like, did the director of Destiny not get along with the art director, and did they ultimately have a split that spread across the team, and like
Right.
you know was a programmer, like they weren't able to get the the renderer to sync up with the art creation pipeline, like in a way that made it easy to develop. Like none of those are actually reasons why Destiny is a bad game. Like every great game has had the same kinds of technical struggles as every bad game has had in one way or the other. Technical struggles are the norm. They're not like unique, but we fixate on these sorts of like mundane procedural things, I think, as just a sign of kind of showing or kind of acquiescence to publishers, sort of like a status acquiescence that like we'll accept the terms that publishers want for how games are portrayed in the public. Because like reporting on like personality conflicts inside game studios do not threaten publishers in any way. They don't threaten the returns investors are getting on the next Call of Duty game, right? They keep the audience kind of fixated in downtimes, and they help create a dramatic frame for like a redemption arc with the sequel, and it's like, well, Call of Duty World War II didn't have enough time to cook, but Black Ops 4 is going to be even better or whatever. Like, even the negative stories, they just, they set up the sort of redemption arc the next way around. But like funny. Covering the investment level, covering the sort of like industry picture, not the sort of like personality kind of fetish that I think a lot of game journalists get stuck in now. I think you can connect the sort of creative shifts in the industry of these like this turn to like these never-ending games like Destiny that you just repeat over and over again, and that they're perennially disappointing, and yet they're just compulsive. People can't stop playing them, and people can't stop rationalizing why they play them, even though they know they don't like them. And it's sort of like it's a direct outgrowth of like an investment strategy that has guided the industry. Like it's it's almost not the developers are just the intermediary. It's almost just investors sort of leading players into new sort of creative corners, and then players and journalists collaborating and rationalizing why this is new and fun and interesting. But like it's not. Nobody wanted to make Destiny. Destiny was a business platform from the beginning. I don't know.
I think that was the series where I heard that quote. I can't remember from who, or it was someone in the executive level just saying, the audience's passion for content is endless, and we it was just talked about in this super distant way. I mean, like something I don't lay awake at night wondering this, but it is weird, I think, as an adult, that I will again just wonder about games in some very basic ways, where it's like, okay, so I know Konami made Castlevania, or I know Ubisoft makes Assassin's Creed, but it's just sort of presented in terms of like, here is the top, creative person who will do all the interviews, and they tell you everything about the world and what you can do in it, but you never hear discussed like what inspired you to create this, and what do you find interesting about it, and what was it like at the publisher side, like what interested them in it. I mean, maybe it doesn't matter, but it is odd. It is odd that it's like those things are mysteries. And I think like if we are going to make the connection in comparison to movies, I don't think those things are mysteries there,
No, and like very similar things happen to the movies as are happening to games now. Like movie studios radically cut back their output. They went from like Paramount went from doing 25 or 30 movies a year to releasing 9 to 11 or 12 in a year. And half of those are co-financing deals. They're not fully financed by Paramount. They're like backed by investment bankers, and like no one actually wants to hold the liability for financing a movie because, it's not that they became risky, but the investors had so many options for where to park their money outside of movies that studios started having to compete at the level of like returns. So, it'd be like, you could park $5 million in Paramount if you want, or $50 million in Paramount. You could get 3% return on a good year. And if it's a bad year, you might lose money or get no return. Or, you could go invest in Facebook and get like a 7% return. So like, if you're an investor and Paramount's asking for money to drum up cash for their next slate, or like, well, why would I give you this fixed sum of money I have when you're not going to guarantee me the same kind of return? Mm-hmm. So they started reshaping their sort of creative output to maximize for return on investment rather than, just continuing to produce creative works in the same sort of tradition that they had been. And that's totally been happening with games for the last 6, 7, 8 years. Like, it's slowly been transformed to sort of meet investors' interest in returns rather than just kind of like cultural continuity with a tradition. So it's now like, everyone wants a Fortnite game that's, relatively inexpensive to produce and then makes $300 million a month or whatever it is. It's a really high margin, high return, game. No one wants to make God of War. It's going to cost, $300 million and take 5 years and, tie up all these assets before you get any kind of return. And then when you get a return, it's probably going to be like relatively small. It's going to be, that game could have bombed. It could have been like Wolfenstein or, Nier Automata. Or like, I don't know if Nier Automata like bombed or not, but like, these are gambles. And so why take a gamble on a game like God of War where the upside is, even in the best case scenario, it's probably pretty limited.
Yeah.
But if you make Radical Heights or some kind of like Fortnite clone, it's probably a lot cheaper to produce. And even if it misses, like, there's still a chance that it could succeed at a higher rate. The margin could be higher than at something that like God of War that might sell more and be better reviewed, but like won't actually give you a return. So, like I think we're just sort of like sitting inside this very specific like investment bank driven culture. And,
yeah.
And you can see it everywhere. It's movies. It's investors using stuff like Uber as Trojan horses to kind of get bigger returns off of these matured industries. Yeah. Like the taxi market was a mature market. There's no growth left to be had in that. But something like Uber allows you to readjust the margins. So like it's not necessarily making the market bigger, but it's giving a more favorable margin to investors by, giving less share to drivers. And, it's a shiny tech story. So, Bloomberg Business Week and, all the sort of like Wired gets to write all these, eager articles in the early phases of the sort of development of the tool.
Right. Advocating.
And then it's like, well, it's still like a third of Uber drivers are losing money driving for the company. Another third are making less than minimum wage, and only the top third are actually, making a salary above minimum wage. So it's like this dystopian kind of success story that's basically only a success for a third of the people that work for it and the investors behind the company. Like a very a very similar thing is happening with games, and that's why it's I think it's really important to consider games not as special or like siloed off and distinct from
Yeah.
all these other forms. But like the art, the trick, the hard part, in writing about them is figuring out how they're like all these other things. What the real pattern is, and that's an ongoing problem. I think it's an ongoing question.
I feel like that's something that, again, in hindsight, as I continue, like that is a thing I am probing, but I'm sure this is something you also have experience with, is you tell people you have one toe of one foot planted in games, and they're not in the games world. They very quickly develop allergy to to wanting to either talk to you or to seem, they're not an expert. And I don't think that they understand the ways in which, it's not even necessarily games have been hurt, but games as an ecosystem have sort of been defanged or gotten lost by resting on its experts. I don't even know who those individuals are. I just know that they are a product of that sort of exceptionalism you're talking about, which I feel like I hear less of, but maybe I just don't hang out in those pockets anymore where people would like scoff at you for talking about games in terms of something else. But those are the types of interviews I'm most curious to do, because I feel like it's uncharted territory for both of us. And there's not that ability to lean back on shorthand that you would in games world, or lean back on that exceptionalism of games are going to be fine, stop complaining, they'll turn themselves around, we know what we're doing. I don't know. It in some ways, it is sort of an Old West period, but I think people who are a product of it being siloed, we're almost at a disadvantage because we know all those vocabulary terms and we know all those leaps in logic we make. And I think people in our cohort, we sort of foresaw, some of us at least enthusiastically, this time coming where there would be cross-pollination. I don't know that we necessarily foresaw we might be made redundant or less potent because of it. And I don't know. I mean, I can't even think of people who were, who I would count in my cohort who are still around. I mean, I think you and I got our start around the same time. There are some developers I met, like Jason Rohrer, who started when I started. Yeah. But it's a small group. It's a small group of us who are still there, sort of still pondering, or maybe they just got cooler and stopped talking to us. I don't know.
I wonder what was it like when you started? You started like freelance, right?
I started, I overlap with the years you did. I started.
You were a little further out from the like enthusiast side, right?
Yeah, I was an editor
for the Onion.
At the Onion, and I helped start there. What became, I don't know if they're still calling it that, but it became the Gameological Society. I just sort of helped them start covering games, which led to my meeting. Would that have been First Wave Kill Screen people? I mean, so I wound up just sort of tumbling in sideways into not
Chris
having
Dolan.
that baggage. Yeah, Chris Dolan and oh man, am I already getting to that age? I can't remember all the other names. Ryan Kuo and
I think
Jamin,
Ryan was
of course.
Sort of second gen.
Yeah.
I think it was originally just Chris and Jamin, and then Ryan came after like a year or two.
I mean, this must have just been percolating on the other side of email threads I had with him. I don't even remember how I got introduced to those guys, but I started writing about games in the mid-aughts, not knowing. I mean, I certainly grew up, reading Nintendo Power and those things and remembering that style of writing, but I didn't start doing that type of writing. I sort of tunneled in backwards to then writing for all those places you rattled off before that are now long gone, like oneup.com and GamePro and all those others. Maybe I'm better off that all those things I did early on were not preserved for the ages. But it's funny because it's like I had to learn about this baggage secondhand, not experiencing it myself. But now on a daily basis, I hear and see sort of the long-term effects of it.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, yeah, it's funny. I guess like everyone sort of envies everyone else. It's like, I mean, I always felt a little bit like starting on the sort of enthusiast side just by dumb luck. Like they were the only people to sort of like answer my emails. Um,
Yeah, yeah.
but I always like envied, you know, places like the Onion, the AV Club, like when I was starting, because I imagine there was more breathing room there. Like I felt like very early on at IGN, I was just sort of like they just throw you into the pool and be like, you know, do whatever you want. Like we publish at 4 p.m. every day.
Yeah.
You have to publish at least one story. No one cares what it is, but like it was like, oh,
I mean,
like what happened? Like, what do I do? And it was like, literally like 10 minutes before the publish deadline, you just email someone and be like, can you just proofread this thing real quick? I got to publish it in 10 minutes. And like they'd add a comma or something, but there was no like, there was no line editing. There was no sort of interrogation of the logic. There was no attempt to like fact check or, try
edit.
and,
Yeah.
yeah, or make it part of a larger sort of like, you know, developing thread of like, hey, just so you know, we've written this same like storytelling in games feature 3 million times already. So like, this argument you're making is sort of like redundant. So maybe like if we frame it in another way, it might be useful or more interesting. There's no like nudging or sort of like creative
Yeah.
sort of development. And I always imagined like these other places, like Gama Sutra or like, you know,
Mm-hmm.
Newsweek or, um, like Eurogamer, back in the day. It was like, to fantasize about, oh, those places must have like real support. But like, I imagine none of them did, right? Like, they're
No,
all,
I mean, I was going to say, like, having interviewed even people who go back further than we do, like people who wrote about, games for the New York Times in the 90s.
yeah,
It's the whole writing, the whole, like, sector of thinking about games has been influenced by so many just weird ways games have slipped through the cracks. Because we were the experts writing for people who have a lot of technical skills and know about writing, but they're just kind of taking your word for it that you know what you're talking about when it comes to the medium and everything else. The conclusions that you're drawing about it. I interviewed this one guy who I actually interviewed both of the guys who together they alternated and had this video game column at the New York Times in the 90s, and
yeah,
I mean, I asked them both, like, where were your bosses getting their wisdom from in guiding you? And I mean, they would edit very strictly for style, but that would be it. So I don't know. It's weird. Maybe this stuff has just always been trying to find its way and has always been kind of dizzy. So, I guess sort of I'm saying to myself, maybe it's not in my head that it's so confusing, even though I feel like I understand some of it. It's just some of this stuff has never been answered, and we're always midstream. And you and I have emailed about this in the past. Just there's always this pressure that you were actually just talking about, but it's the same, at the Washington Post or anywhere else where there's just this pressure to sort of, before you've chewed your food, like,
right,
like, telling people what you digested from it. I don't know. I mean, I'm not that kind of writer, but so I think now that the worm has sort of turned where there's almost it's almost seen as an artifice or this weird kabuki of, well, I thought about what I think for a while. Here's what I think. And I think games too suffers from it. People say it moves very fast, or like Detroit Become Human just came out, but after E3, that's going to seem like 2 years ago, even though that's 2 weeks from now.
Yeah.
So there's just not a lot of time to breathe and process. And, the same things that I described in New York Times in the 90s, those were the same things I experienced at The Onion in the aughts, where I wrote album reviews and I wrote game reviews, and they were not edited in the same way.
Right.
They were much more nitpicky on album reviews than they were game reviews. And it's like a decade or so later now.
Yeah.
I can't quantify what we're talking about. People are nitpicky versus what they're not nitpicky about, but there still are a lot of things to rake over that I don't think. I don't even know what you would label this category of what we've been talking about, but clearly you and I are on the same page about something. I just don't know what the title of that chapter is. It's just sort of like Gus Mastrapa, right? He talks we talk about this thing about just the problem of thinking about games, and I think that's the title of the chapter.
Right. What's Gus doing? Is he still writing? I lost track of him.
No,
I was never close. I don't think we've met, but I knew of him.
He lives out in the desert in Southern California, and he is a stay-at-home dad. And he's not really writing, but he's playing a lot of Destiny. I can tell you that.
Okay.
But that's sort of that's what has happened to folks from our cohort.
Yeah. It's sort of to go back to the generational thing. It was sort of, I don't really have plans to go anywhere. I'm going to continue to write about games probably until I'm dead.
You won't keep writing after you're dead?
I might. I don't know.
You really do have no plans.
Yeah. I get a ghostwriter job.
Wow.
Yeah.
No, I hear you. I mean, it's,
but
I don't know. I feel similarly, I'm going to continue with this. It's weird because it feels like the longer it goes on, the more it must seem like I'm duty bound to, people want to know, I don't know, not what's the point, but what was the purpose of it? And it's not ending. It will continue. It's just been this sort of space for me to air, sometimes the point is just to ask and just to sort of,
right.
Not even document it, but just let it linger in the air, and you'll figure it out later.
Well, so I don't know.
Yeah.
Part of my thinking about this was thinking about what is as you age, you age out of these positions, right?
Right.
So I noticed when I was freelancing for IGN, it was just sort of. There was never any grand moment where I stopped. It was just one by one, all my contacts there kind of went away. Just one person got a job doing PR, another one went to marketing, another one went to work at a game developer. And then I was like, oh, cool. And then all of a sudden it was just I don't know anyone to pitch there anymore even. So this.
Yeah.
And that's fine, but the sort of you notice all these people that come to take those positions over. I started to think what were those positions that we were leaving for the people that came after us? What is that what is that structure that this new group of people? I don't know if it's a new generation or not. That's too dramatic about it, but I'm less interested in my own accomplishments and just sort of looking at what the material kind of resources are, the sort of role itself that other people are sort of coming into and that I was sort of coming out of, because at the beginning I was I can't write about games without a position somewhere. And now it's well, I'll just keep writing about them no matter what. It'll maybe it'll be a Washington Post review or another story for the Times or the Outline or whoever. I'll figure out a way. I don't need to worry about that anymore. But still reading. I love reading places like Bullet Points, which I think does an amazing an amazing sort of like, in a way, it's like a very moral approach to games by sort of like, limiting the focus to one game a month. It's sort of like the antidote in a lot of ways to this obsessive kind of churn of like every day there's a new story of like Rage 2 got announced, and then now it's Street Fighter 30th anniversary edition, and now it's like DLC for whatever X game. It's just this constant amnesiac sort of churn.
Yeah.
And a publication like that sort of like, it was, in a broad way, it was sort of like something like I had always sort of fantasized about existing. And, I think everyone that writes for it, is writing at a much higher level than like I ever was able to. And like most people in my cohort were.
Yeah.
And it, like, that really excites me in a way. Like I feel like really happy about that. On the other hand, I know those people are struggling, desperately because like, I know there's no money in that kind of stuff either. I know they're making do with very little, the heterotopia is a sort of like architectural focus on games criticism, and like, what's d-orbital or disorbital? Dielicinas, like, I mean, these are amazing things. Like, this is why I say I think games criticism is in a much better place than games journalism. And I think one of the main reasons for that is that games journalism is, you can't do journalism without resources.
Yeah.
You like, with criticism, you use yourself as a resource. And that's part of what I admire in a lot of these writers is, I know like to a degree you're burning through yourself to produce these like, these concise, beautifully phrased, kind of incisive research stories. And, that's part of the beauty of criticism. That's part of the intimacy of it. You get a sense that this person has sort of, even if it's opaque or unclear sometimes, that they've left a little piece of their own vital energy in, creating this thing. But like, you can't do games journalism without a ticket to China, or like, like, you can't fake that. You can't just burn your, like, they don't take burned vital energy at the travel agency. Like,
they should.
No one gives a shit. Like, you
yeah.
You need like structural resources at a certain point. And I like the work that I was doing at IGN, like, looking back on it, like, we didn't have resources to do journalism back then. It was sort of just like this conflagration of inexperienced, unskilled critics that were just sort of like thrown together like a sort of band of mercenaries and just told to go out and fill all those empty slots on the publication. And, you were a good mercenary if, you knew something about Dreamcast games, or you had some sort of irrational fixation on this sort of like childhood pastime.
Yeah.
And that was, that was kind of it. And so like, I worry that like, the entire premise of the games media is built on an absence of resources that, is designed to exploit a labor base that cares more about the subject than the publishers do. And like, the same way that like, Uber, is premised on people needing work more than they need, time off, or what, like, people are more desperate for jobs, so they're willing to take a gamble on signing up for an Uber sanctioned lease and, accepting all these new sort of financial burdens in their life if it means they'll be able to potentially have a viable job moving forward. And then, 2/3 of them lose out doing that, basically. But the promise of it is what gets people into that setup in the first place. And, I think there's a similar dynamic that happens in games media that, there's a lot of like good faith at the labor level, and publishers are sort of detached enough, and the working conditions themselves kind of like guarantee that, like, I mean, you come out of writing for a place like IGN after 5 years, like, your clips are not useful to get you a job anywhere else. Like, you can call yourself a game journalist until you're blue in the face. No one is going to read your gossip report on what happened with the development of Dragon Age and sort of think that's comparable to any other kind of like, piece of journalism about, I don't know, like someone that was like pressured by a district attorney. Like the last story I read, a young kid in MS-13, was pressured to testify against MS-13 in exchange for immunity. And then once he testified, he was transferred to ICE. The DA just sort of like washed their hands of him. And like, like these are two very, like, reporting on these two stories, these are two very different forms of like public interest that are being served here. So like, like games journalism is not journalism. And like, it's the fatal flaw of it, no matter how, insistent you want to be about the label. If games journalism was actually journalism, it would just be journalism. It wouldn't be games.
It wouldn't need to be qualified.
Yeah. You don't call like, I don't know.
Well,
so
sorry, continue.
Nah, that's it. I'm just repeating myself now. It's okay. Just,
I do know. I know very well.
Yeah, it's just labor compensating for like the not the absent parent, but the absent boss. It's like it's a bizarre dynamic. It's like, in a way, like you could see it with comics and like movies, and the way superhero movies have become ascendant, where they're, they all have in common this sort of like feeding off of like adolescent pastimes, because, in a way, these are all sort of surrogate parents. They're what your parents kind of feed you when they don't want to deal with you. Like, go play Dragon Quest, go watch your DVDs, go on your internet chat room or wherever. So like, there are these forms of like identity formation that become professionalized, and then the professionalization is itself kind of isolating, and it necessitates these sort of like specialized labels of like, I'm not actually into reporting. I'm into games reporting. Like, I've figured out through carefully combing through like patents that Nintendo is releasing Ice Climbers 3D next,
Well, I don't know. I mean, I feel like an odd specimen, with, what I have been gathering here with this. And I don't know, because I feel like it exists in this weird satellite space, just in those cracks that you said and that we described, and people come to it from their own, tangentially connected point to those cracks. And I never claimed to have any answers. I don't know that I need to have any, but I have come to sort of realize there is this goal of, I don't know, wanting to. I used to think it would be through, pitching journalism of finding ways to sculpt these so many interviews down, not all of them, but finding a few, finding a trend, finding a way in to write about things that I felt like weren't being examined elsewhere. Right. I don't know that that's changed. It just may be that I didn't understand when I started this. Maybe it was going on some other path to some other place that wasn't that. As I said up top, it wasn't the path I wanted to go down in the first place. But I don't know. I mean, it's an odd thing that has become my my normal, you and I have spoken before and we're familiar with each other's work before, but I spend most of my time coaxing complete strangers into just sort of having these abstract, sometimes existential conversations about, labor conditions or their hopes and dreams about what art is, what it can be. I don't know. In some ways, like, it is all about games, but I don't think that that's the totality of it,
No, it's all our lives together. Like,
yeah.
and I mean, I think part of like the eagerness people have had to over-identify with these sort of marginal, like, interests, like video game fandom or comics fandom. These are all symptomatic of just a deepening dissociation or social dissolution that's been happening for the last 30 or 40 years. And it's like framed and been underwritten by a lot of economic shifts from like the, widespread deregulation, like the massive shifts in banking that have happened since the early 80s, changes in copyright law, being able to copyright gene sequences to, and biological material to then like being able to, feel like you're entitled to really claim as your own, like, any small, like, piece of culture. Like, you're not entitled to speak about The Simpsons season 13. That's my shit. Like, the fuck out. You don't know anything about it. Like, like, don't talk to me about Dragon Quest. Like, did you play you haven't even played Dragon Quest 4. Like, you didn't even have a Super Nintendo. Like, get out of here. Like, like, these are all signs of a sort of communal identity that's like fraying. That, like, if we were seeking secondary identities in things that are, that in previous generations were explicitly defined as like pastimes. You know what I mean? Like,
I do. I've often said too that I don't. It's not even relevant to say anymore, but I never felt cool enough to be a nerd.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's true. And it's like, and that's the trick of criticism too. I think I know not everyone likes Anthony Lane, but I think one thing he does really well with like film reviews is that he captures the dynamics in a film while still kind of being universally dismissive of what's at stake in any given film. Like, and I think that's an attitude that is almost never applied in games criticism. It's like, everyone, myself included, it's hard to write a game review or a critique in any way without kind of trying to swing for the fences instead of just breezily being, this is David Cage sure is like super racist and like detached, but like, I don't know, it's kind of neat how you can use the analog sticks to turn doorknobs. Like, it's the emphasis. It's like, well, like, critiquing David Cage's racism isn't necessarily a critique of racism, right? Like, and that's sort of the paradox. It's like, you can't not address it. It has to be, addressed. It has to be attacked on all fronts, those sorts of things. But then, like, you run up to the paradox of like, well, now I've addressed it in a video game, but 99.9% of the problem lies outside of video games still. So like, there's still like this overarching insignificance to, a critique of a game that reaches a certain level of like indignation or, heatedness. And like, that was a trap I fell into in a lot of my early writing. Like, I wrote something about the very first Modern Warfare. It was just like really indignant, about like how brazen it was, how tasteless it was to make an entertainment out of the war in Iraq and Afghanistan, and to not even have the courage to name the countries that you were sort of drawing inspiration from, in that first Modern Warfare. It was just, and it really pissed me off at the time. I was like, what a gutless, weaselly, just terrible creative choice to have made. At the same time, the game's like winning Game of the Year, and everyone's like running around prestiging and double prestiging and like talking about how this redefines shooters. But like, that indignation didn't really serve me all that well either, right? It was like there wasn't all that much at stake in sort of pushing against Modern Warfare. Like the toothpaste was out of the tube by the time a game developer had the courage to make a game that like in some oblique way referenced, the U.S. invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan, like, and in its own contorted way, made it still kind of like a neo-Cold War story about Russia pulling everyone's strings, like, I think it's easy in that sort of vacuum where you don't have a lot of material support and a lot of mentorship around you to go overboard with your own vision and to lose track of like what really is at stake in a game, which is just it's pastime. And that, it's not to be dismissive of it, but like, pastimes can be, incredibly powerful and personal, but like, they can only ever be sort of like pretext to like the rest of your life. They're never the actual main part of your life. And the more they sort of start to become the main part of your life, the less your life starts to feel like it's worth. And that sends everything sort of cockeyed.
No, I would agree. I mean, I think, I don't know, this seems like an odd note I don't know if you need to get going or if this is an odd note to wind down on, but, I've often felt that is sort of the value of games, is that they don't need to be, the center. They don't need to be very important and heightened and make huge statements or to be capital A art, and certainly they're capable of that. I've always appreciated their ability to just sort of be a respite, just to sort of be a breather. And I don't know, there's been a lot of I don't know, it's just it just seems to be a thing that it incubates insecurity and creates more.
Yeah. I mean, it's true though. We live, we live in an insecure age, and video games are the art of insecurity. So
that's something people always say, video games, we won, everyone plays them now, so,
and no one likes them.
Yeah, that's a great note to end on.
Yeah. Perfect.